People have long believed that in certain circumstances, the human body can burst into flames of its own accord. Flames, furthermore, of such ferocity that within minutes the victim is reduced to a heap of carbonized ashes. This idea, some call it a superstition, has been around for centuries, smouldering in the belief in divine retribution. There is an extensive history documenting the nature of spontaneous human combustion, but it's a history of scientific refusal to face up to the bizarre phenomenon. Why has it bemused scientists for so long, and how does it wreak such terrifying destruction? Perhaps its most common characteristic is the sheer speed in which it strikes. Many victims were seen alive only a few moments before the fire struck from nowhere. In one instance, an Italian priest, lodging with his brother-in-law, had been left alone in his room, reading a prayer book. A few minutes later, he screamed. People came running to find him on the floor, surrounded by a pale flame which receded as they approached. His outer clothes had burned away, leaving a sackcloth he wore underneath intact. Under the sackcloth, the skin on the man's trunk was in shreds. Investigators believe that the fire develops very quickly because the victims are often discovered still sitting calmly, as though nothing had happened. In one dramatic example, in 1960, 5 charred bodies were found in a burned-out car in Kentucky, USA. The coroner commented that they were just sitting there as though they'd just gotten into the car. With all that heat, it seemed there'd be some sort of struggle to escape, but there hadn't been. The baffling aspect of spontaneous human combustion is the extreme intensity of heat involved. In normal circumstances, the human body is very hard to set alight, especially if still alive, and people who die in fires usually sustain only partial or superficial damage to the body. Reduction to a pile of calcinated ashes, experts agree, demands a fierce heat which needs to be externally fueled and maintained for hours. The disturbing circumstances surrounding the death of a Florida woman in July 1951 were investigated. The ashes of the 67-year-old widow were mixed with the remains of the chair she had been sitting in. Damage to the surrounding area was minimal. The overstuffed chair was burned down to its springs. There was a patch of soot on the ceiling above, and a small circle of carpet was charred around the chair, but a pile of papers nearby was untouched. Police considered every likely theory: suicide by petrol, ignition of methane gas in her body, murder by flamethrower, magnesium, phosphorus and napalm substances, and even a ball of fire, which one anonymous letter writer claimed to see. In the end, the coroner accepted the theory that she had fallen asleep whilst smoking and set her clothes alight, although the case remains open. The weight of accumulated case histories is a reminder that spontaneous combustion cannot continue to be brushed aside by coroners or simply disregarded by medical experts as a phenomenon too rare to warrant investigation. In fact, modern researchers reject the idea that it is as rare as some suggest. The medical profession has always been embarrassed by deaths that appear to have been caused by spontaneous combustion. The refusal to believe in the phenomenon is the result of a deliberate conspiracy to suppress the evidence. If spontaneous combustion is mentioned at all, it is only to be dismissed as a belief mistakenly held by the uninformed, or as a superstition lingering from less enlightened times. Today, there are several theories that might account for spontaneous human combustion. While none are conclusive, some do appear more credible than others. One of the least likely is the psychic suicide theory, which suggests that spontaneous human combustion might be self-induced by depressed or resentful people. Their reserves of physical and physical energy may suddenly be released in a fatal, destructive explosion. This explanation, however, offers no proof and would account for only some spontaneous human combustion cases, as would the hypothesis that postulates organic or mechanical malfunctions of normal bodily processes. Another explanation is the proposition that spontaneous human combustion is the result of people who have caught fire themselves after their clothes have been set alight. This is disproved by numerous cases in which only the flesh of victims was burnt, while their clothes remained unscorched. The lack of any sign of fire in many cases has led some researchers to theorize about substances that can burn without flame. Ball lightning has been offered as one other possible culprit. As it is a natural phenomenon, and because ball lightning is notoriously capricious, it is the best candidate so far for the cause of spontaneous human combustion cases, whether ancient or modern. It would also account for the victims being fried from the inside out. Not one of these theories can, by itself, account for the bizarre varieties of human combustion on record. It is conceivable that we have almost all the pieces of the puzzle, but that medical science has yet to fit them together. Perhaps science fails because the mystery of what makes human bonfires is a mixture of physical and earthly forces combined with human psychological phenomena. We await a science that can analyze and interpret both together. One night in 1934 at the O. Henry Ballroom in Chicago, USA, a young dancer quarreled with her boyfriend and decided to hitchhike home alone. She was ultimately hit by a car and killed. Because no one knew her name, she became known as Resurrection Mary, after the Resurrection Cemetery in a Chicago suburb where she was buried. Her ghost began appearing 5 years later. Several motorists reported picking up a young woman dressed in white who asked to be taken to the ballroom or driven directly to the cemetery. She would then mysteriously vanish. Resurrection Mary was quietly aloof but unusually talkative. It seems that others of her kind in sightings around the world typically break the silence only to state their destination or issue some dire warning. Resurrection Mary is an early example of eerie encounters with roadside ghosts, collectively known as phantom hitchhikers. One of the most celebrated modern cases involving multiple witnesses occurred in France near Montpellier in 1981. Shortly before midnight, a two-door Renault pulled over to pick up a woman. 4 people were already inside the car, so the hitchhiker's unexpected presence necessitated some rearrangement of seating. Eventually, she settled into the rear seat. The car continued on its way, loud music blaring from the cassette player. As it neared a sharp curve, the hitchhiker suddenly shouted,
"Slow down or you'll be killed."
The driver slowed down and negotiated the turn safely. At that point, a speeding vehicle came the other way, narrowly missing the car the others were travelling in. As the driver looked in his rear view to thank the woman, they all realised that their passenger had vanished. So shaken were the 4 passengers that they called at the Montpellier police station and reported the incident. Impressed, Inspector Lopez later told researchers that he believed the passengers and he knew they weren't telling lies. All that can be safely said about phantom hitchhikers is that they echo the traditional ghost of old. Like so many apparitions, their stories often have overtones of thwarted love. They are also often responsible for narrowly averting tragedy, and their behaviour, fleeting appearance and abrupt disappearance, is in keeping with the best ghostly traditions. The US town of Mattoon in Illinois was ravaged by a mystery illness late in the summer of 1944. The cause was thought to be an invisible substance with, as one victim put it, a sickening sweet odour which could induce paralysis. On one occasion, a victim's husband saw a stranger standing by the window. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing and wearing a tight-fitting cap. Several such incidents took place before the local paper, the Mattoon Daily Journal, reported them, running the story in overall prose suggesting a maniac had Mattoon under siege. A form of mass hysteria may have been the result, as other gas attacks were soon being reported. Mattoon citizens described a prowler by their windows just before fumes poured into the room, causing physical shock, then nausea, paralysis, burnt mouths and throats, and swollen faces. As police desperately sought the figure, now called the Mad Gasser, they found ambiguous physical evidence, including tracks and a skeleton key apparently left by the attacker. Failure to arrest the attacker led to a formation of an armed posse. Nevertheless, the attacks still continued, sometimes 2 or 3 each night. Eventually, Mattoon officials denied that anything was happening other than mass hysteria. The police chief insisted that there was absolutely no evidence to support such stories. The gases last reported spraying came the next day. A witness described the attacker as a woman dressed in man's clothing. The victim and his son subsequently found footprints of high-heeled shoes under the bedroom window. The police refused to investigate. Theories to explain this episode have included the intrusion of otherworldly beings, or perhaps a prankster with a malicious sense of humor. The sensationalist Chicago Herald-American suggested an ape man was responsible. The attacks suddenly stopped, and no further incidences were reported. The police, to this day, have yet to find an explanation or a culprit.